welcome everybody. I'd like to thank you for joining us for part 2 of our product development masterclass that's being led by our friends at Modus Create. As you guys know, this is invite only for our alumni and special guests. So, and this is a continuation of last week's part 1. Hopefully you guys have had a chance to do a little bit of the homework assignment and or watch the video. I found it to be super valuable for myself personally, so I hope you guys did as well. We're going to have 1 hour today. Basically, we will go into breakout rooms and talk a little bit about the assignment, which was to create and sort of validate the personas that we talked about last week. And then we'll come back after a certain amount of time, 20 or 30 minutes, and then we can have a group session again. We do have a Slack channel. For those of you who are not on Slack, Skylar, who's our co-host, will put the Slack channel link on to the chat, and then you can join that, and then she'll put you into the masterclass. We have a private Slack channel for the masterclass, so hopefully you guys will be using that to communicate with each other and also communicate with Pat and JD and team. So with that, I want to introduce you to Pat Sheridan, who's the founder and managing partner at Modus Create. You guys probably know Pat from CONNECTpreneur and also from last week, and we really are very grateful to him and his company for supporting us financially with the CONNECTpreneur program, and also for supporting us with programs like this masterclass. And with that, I do want to turn it over to Pat. I will say this as an endorsement. Pat has been involved in 3 companies, or his company has helped 3 companies that I'm either on the board of or an investor in, and they have knocked it out of the park. So for those of you who are looking for development, code review, anything, front-end design, UI, UX, very without reservation recommend Modus. So with that, I'll turn it over to Pat, and Pat and his team will take it away. Pat, thank you so much.
Hey, thanks, Tian, and hello again, everyone. We're excited to dive in today. I think, for those of you that have read the Lean Startup book, and obviously have an evolving conversation with your customers, there's always something to learn and something new. So we're excited. I know we pushed a lot of info over JD and Dimitri last week. We're really interested to see what folks learned in the course of just validating some of their assumptions and going through the persona exercise today. So I'll just kind of keep it brief here so we can jump into the breakout sessions. JD, was there anything that you just wanted to help maybe seed some conversation? I think what might be good before we go into the session is to just kind of ask for a volunteer or 2 that went through that thinks it would be valuable for the group in the breakout room to kind of talk through some of the work they did or some of the challenges that they had. And that way we can kind of seed a couple folks in the breakout room to help us kind of use your work to run the breakout session. JD, any other thoughts that you think will be helpful?
Yeah, that's totally the plan. If we look at the agenda for today, we'll spend about maybe the first half of the session just getting into these breakout rooms, taking volunteers on, whoever wants to present their personas so they can get feedback. And then after that, we're going to talk a little bit about how do we take these workshops you've done and start to put them into practice. So what we'll be doing when we review the personas is we'll take a look at everything that, you all have put down and, try to answer these questions. Like, have we really gotten to the real kind of like underlying issue? Is everything on the persona relevant, right? That's something we talked about last week during our session. And then we'll walk through like, where are you uncertain? What assumptions have you made about your users? And what do you want to know more about your users? Where do you have open questions? So that's kind of like, the topic of conversation when we review these. I think before we get into the breakout rooms, we did just want to do a quick check and make sure that, some people were able to do the homework. So I think maybe we can just do a quick show of hands. That might be the best way. Try to see one. And if you want to use the virtual hand raise, that works too. Okay, yeah. So I saw a few people, so it looks like we'll at least have 2. So we should be good to go with 2 breakout rooms. So yeah, that's the plan. We're going to get into breakout rooms. You'll have one with Pat and one with me. and it'll just kind of be like, if I bring up the ground rules here, we're going to just do like first come, first serve. You get 3 minutes to present one persona, and then we can do a round of like what we call speed critique. So you can kind of see, you know, this is something we actually do in our workshops, how we actually facilitate. Speed critique is like we get 1 minute max from each critic. They can ask questions, specifically those questions that we highlighted on the last slide. And another thing we do in our workshops is we use these I like, I wish, and I wonder statements, right? So I like is like, oh, I like this about that persona. It's super clear. I wish could be, you know, I wish this item was more clear. And I wonder is like if you have a question that's not, you know, that's not clear with the persona, you could say, oh, I'm wondering about this thing. Sound good? Any questions before we jump into the breakout rooms?
Let's do it.
All right. See you in there.
So it sounds like Peter and Sean, I saw them raise their hands. So maybe we put Peter and Sean at least in each of the rooms, and then we can randomly do everyone else if that's possible.
So hopefully that was valuable for everyone, and we learned a little bit about Proto Personas. I think some of the key things that came up in our session were a lot of discussion around like demographics and how those relate to the personas. I think the key fact or sort of key insight there for everyone was like demographics are great to include on Proto Personas or personas, but really only if they're going to affect someone's behavior, if they're actually like causing the behavior, right? So like, because I'm 50 years old, I exhibit this specific behavior or goal or whatever it is. And then we also talked about, you know, an important part of the exercise being going through, looking at every insight you wrote down and ranking your confidence in that insight. Like, how confident are you that it's true? And the ones you're less confident in, now you have some, basically some fuel for you to go and do your user research and get more certain. So those are the big themes from our session. Pat, anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, I think there was a really good discussion in our room as well. It was interesting that both of the folks whose Miro boards we looked at were in regulated industries, which can also make it more challenging to get access, right, to personas if you're looking at kind of financial, folks working in finance or folks working in the medical profession. You know, one takeaway was, I think if you're not familiar with Miro and even the templates we shared, they can come across as a little overwhelming, and you can kind of dive in there. But the idea is that, you know, just as a reminder that these deliverables aren't really valuable in and of themselves. It's to help make decisions on what you're committing your engineering dollars and your kind of product prioritization to. Similar to what you said, JD, on the Proto Personas, you know, for folks that essentially, I would say like your strength can be a weakness sometimes. If you come from an industry and you worked in one of the roles, you can be very much biased by your experience. And I think there was a lot of interesting discussion and looking at the two examples that folks shared where you can, it's a great starting point to have direct experience as one of the personas of the system. But then just doing kind of a mental exercise on testing the extremes of the position of the persona, meaning in one case it was for medical professionals in outlying rural areas for telemedicine. And so when you think about that as a archetype or a kind of example persona, using your interviews to test out, well, what if they're from a major conglomerate? What if they're, you know, what are the things around a typical day in their life? How many touch points would they have with the system? And what are things we need to think about to go beyond one example, where we don't want to be overly biased by one, you know, assumptive type of user. But it was great. I think folks, you know, did a very valiant first effort on this, and there's a lot obviously to absorb in, but the idea of moving from proto persona into then strategies on increasing, you know, the number of validated, right, conversations that you could have, or those kind of techniques. I think folks set up really good on the first part, and it would be great to see how they kind of take it from there. So I'll just hand it off back over to you, JD.
Thanks, Pat. Yeah, just to, like, I think one part there is so key, like this idea of not, like when we do user research and we do these sessions, we ask people to try to leave their knowledge at the door. Because like Pat said, all of that experience can really sort of taint the way that you're looking at things. And one thing we see a lot when we do research with clients is, you know, they often make the mistake of like, oh, we're just doing this research to like confirm what I already think. But when you're doing research, the point is not to necessarily confirm an existing thought. It's to uncover new things that you don't know, right? So we ask people to go into it with an open mind, and just be open to the idea that like, hey, the idea in your head, you know, you might learn something completely new that invalidates that. Cool. Well, so we've got maybe about 10 minutes left. So what I want to talk about now is, you know, what do we do once we're done with all these workshops, right? So we walked through all the workshops in the last session. You've got all these Miro boards. You've got Post-it notes on the Miro boards. How do you take those Post-it notes and the outputs and put them into action, right? And make them more valuable. And I'm probably going to hit some of the highlights here because there's quite a bit of content, and there are resources in here. So we'll share the deck out and you'll have access to that. But, you know, a high level picture, it's important to note that the workshops really are just the tip of the iceberg. Like they're not the end all be all of product development. They're a great way to get your team on the same page, but there's still a lot of work to do from there, right? So we run the workshops, and then after the workshops, what we do is we spend a week or two doing these things in parallel, right? And I'm going to give you some details and resources for each of these things in the prezo here. After that 1 to 2 weeks, we move into what we call Sprint Zero, which is where we're doing research to, you know, test those assumptions that we underlined in the personas and other exercises. We're starting design for the features that we're most certain about, right? Because you're going to come out of the workshops with like some certainty around certain features, less certainty around others. The ones you're less certain about, that's where you'll go do research. And then on like the development side, you know, you can have your engineers working in parallel to set up their dev environments. You can have project managers getting things into Jira, you know, doing all that setup stuff while the design team and the research team are just getting out ahead. So that's like big picture how this works. From there, it's just, you know, you get into these sprint iterations where your design team is out ahead of development by a sprint or two. They've got this big picture thanks to the workshops, so they're not just like myopically focused on one thing at a time. So I want to start with digging into prototyping and testing because that's probably where a bulk of the work is in that 1 to 2 week time span after the workshops. And I kind of want to just give you like, you know, establish what prototyping and testing even is before we talk about, you know, why to do it. So, you know, we start with recruiting users, right? That's like step one with the prototyping and testing. And we'll actually start that during the workshops so that when we come out of the workshop, we have this hard deadline of, okay, we're going to test on this date with this many people. And it creates a sense of urgency. And it really forces us to, you know, make decisions fast during the kickstart so that we don't get into like analysis paralysis. Because really, until you put an idea in front of real customers, all the analysis you do is just conjecture at that point. So we want to set these deadlines so like we get things in front of people instead of just like continuing to spin our wheels. Then we prototype our most important workflows from the product, right? So the key phrase there is most important workflows, as defined in our user story mapping workshop, right? A big part of that is prioritization. And this is the beauty of Kickstart. It allows you to zoom out, see that big picture, but then immediately start to bite off these small manageable chunks of work so that you can stay nimble, you can adapt to the market, and you can stay focused. From there, right after you create that prototype, you'll write out the tasks that you want to test. You'll have real users try to complete those tasks and think out loud. So thinking out loud, what that means is like your users will say what they're trying to accomplish, what's confusing them, generally just stream of consciousness, thinking out loud. And that really gives us insights into like, you don't just see that they're hitting an issue, you see why they're experiencing that issue, what led them to that. And that allows you to fix the issue much better. Then we note those issues down. People will inevitably run into issues. Talk about that in a second. And then we go back into solution mode, prioritize them, fix them. So that's like high level process. If we take a look at an example, right, like this is an example output you might get out of like a usability testing session or sessions. So from our marketplace kickstart, if you remember, we ran this internal kickstart for a marketplace app. We asked participants to complete these 8 tasks. And you can see here, for some tasks, every participant was successful. For others, not so much. We tested this like interaction pattern where you had to long press to compare something. People failed it. Well, people didn't fail it, right? The experience failed them every single time. And that's key to say it that way. Our experience failed them, not they failed. Because that's a key nuance. When you're doing usability testing, you're not testing the user. You're testing the product. And this is kind of just my axe to grind, but try not to call it user testing. Try to call it usability testing, because you're not testing the user. And just those like little terminology things can really set the culture at your company, right? The other important thing here is like these numbers don't tell you the full picture, right? They're just kind of telling you where people failed and where they did well. What they're not telling you is like, well, why did they have trouble, right? And without that why, we can't really fix anything. We can't go back to the designs and make anything better. So that's why the think out loud is so important and why it's so important to capture this qualitative data. So like here as an example, we were asking people to, kind of explain how the marketplace worked, how they thought it worked. And we saw that this word shop was throwing them off because they weren't sure if that meant like shop in person, shop online, or they just browsing. Why is there a time frame? It was confusing to them. So based on that, we were able to go back and, change the terminology and explain this more clearly. Which brings us to our next slide, why test to begin with? So the main point here is like, you want to find these issues before it's too costly to fix them, right? Once a product goes to development, it's orders of magnitude more expensive in most cases to fix an issue when you find it. If you find it when it's just a no-code prototype, super easy to fix, usually. The other kind of like side benefit that you get is you get to understand how valuable your product is to people by, just having them use it and see how they react to it. Now, the caveat there is your analysis there will inherently be a little subjective, right? There's no way to quantify, unless you're asking people to start paying you immediately. There's no real way to quantify like how valuable they think this product could be to them. So you sort of have to read into like their body language. You have to cross-reference their response with like everything else you know about them. So if they say like, oh yeah, I think this is a great idea, but then in your other discussions you realize, wait, this actually isn't solving a big problem for them, then you've got to, sorry, allergies. You've got to take that feedback with a grain of salt. So that's why we test. On the next slide, I won't read through this in detail, but we just have some tips on, how you can go through and actually do these usability tests. If you want to try to do one yourself, I do think a usability test is something that's achievable versus like more in-depth user research. For that, you might want to hire a professional who has a lot of experience with that. But with a usability test, it's something that you can get some practice with and run one pretty well yourself, even if you don't have like experience in that. So as an example, we've included a script here that you can follow and read through. That'll just give you some guidance on how to run these sessions. The other thing that I think is important to talk about, if we can, keep going just for a few minutes, is the business and product KPIs. So why are these so important? Well, essentially, we've got these measurable targets for your business and your product goals now. Out of the workshop, right, the goal alignment workshop, you've identified some high-level goals, maybe some metrics you can start to track. Here, your goal is to make those measurable and define a line in the sand. Like, if we don't hit this number, we're not happy. And that list of targets should be, we want it to be easily accessible, and we want them to have deadlines. But ultimately, having that list means nothing if it just sits in like some digital space somewhere where no one ever sees it. Leadership in your company needs to constantly refer back to these KPIs in everyday decisions, right? So if you're prioritizing features, for example, which feature best serves your highest priority KPIs? Or if you're deciding between two versions of a design, which version do you think will best hit your product KPIs? So here's an example. You can take a look at this offline, but the one thing I wanted to key in on here is, like, one of the biggest questions we get is, well, how do I actually define the targets? How do I know like what's good and what's bad for each of these metrics? And there's a few different resources we can point you to. Number one, you can look at benchmarks in your industry. There are a ton of reports out there on these things. Like, let's say that one of your main KPIs is like conversion rate on your landing page. You can go and look at like Unbounce's conversion rate, yearly report and see, okay, I'm in the fitness industry. The average conversion rate is 9%. So maybe I want to aim for 9%, or maybe I want to aim for like a little bit higher. The other thing here is, like, sometimes when you're choosing your targets, it's just a little bit common sense too. Like, if one of your KPIs is marketing spend, you want that to be above 1, because if it's below 1, then whenever you spend money on your business, you're making less money, and that's not going to be sustainable. So the other resource I can point you to here is a book that I read that was like somewhat transformational in my career and in my understanding of like just how design can impact business. In this book, it's called Lean Analytics. It's by Alistair Kroll and Benjamin Yaskevitz. They give you sort of like a playbook on, depending on what stage your company is in and what your business model is, they outline, okay, these are the metrics you should be tracking, the targets you should be looking at, and why you should be tracking those metrics. So if you're looking for just like a place to get started, learn more about analytics, this is, one of my biggest recommendations. Take a look at that book. But yeah, just taking a look at time. We do have some other content here. I think we can share this out and you all can take a look at it. But I think we can pause now, and if anyone has questions, happy to answer.
Hey, this is Henry. I have a question. With regards to the user testing, in terms of, I think your path that you showed in the slide with the 1 to 2 weeks doing the research and then before you get into the prototyping, the batch size, right? After you basically can, you do your research, you conduct the user test, right? How many users should you test in a batch before, let's say you go ahead and code it and say, okay, this will actually work? What is your recommendation?
Yeah, there's actually a lot of debate around this in the design community. So I don't know, maybe it's like 10, 20, 15 years ago, this guy, Jacob Nielsen, who's like one of the godfathers of like design and UX, came out with a study that said, when you're doing usability testing, you only need to test with 5 to 8 users to find, I think it was 80% of the usability issues. So that's kind of like a rule of thumb that a lot of people go by. That said, if you're working with a tool where you have lots of different roles, lots of different personas, it then becomes 5 to 8 people from each role and each persona, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because those people are going to use the tool differently. They're going to perceive it differently. They'll probably still experience some of the same issues. So it comes down to a business decision, right? It's a return on investment decision. You're going to be spending time doing the testing. You're going to be spending money probably compensating these participants. So a lot of times what we'll do is we'll start out with 5 to 8, see what we find, see if we start to see what we call saturation, which is like we're just seeing the same issues over and over again. If we're not hitting that point, then it could make sense to go and recruit more people and do more interviews, more usability tests.
Okay, and then my second question would be the folks that you're recruiting. In my experience, I know early on, depending on the stage where you might be with the product or the feature,
Mm-hmm.
if you're early stage, you might go out. What I did was basically grab anybody who was breathing that would test, right? But you just learn that's really not a good strategy, because they don't fit the persona. So,
right.
What is your recommendation there? Because it's a lot of time and effort. Working through that.
I can't stress enough how important it is to test with representative users, right? And representative means it is someone who fits the persona. Obviously, that's going to be different depending on how you define your personas. You'll have to define your screening criteria and make sure that they fit the mold. But like a lot of companies, they'll test like internally with their employees, but that's going to give you really unreliable data, right? Because everyone at your company knows things about this product that you're building, or they have a completely different perspective. The one caveat there is like if you're building a tool for those internal employees, then sure, test with them. But it's really important to test with your actual prospective users or current users.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Thanks for your questions.
Have you ever paid users or testers?
Yes, we do that whenever we can, mainly because, it really helps shorten the timelines of doing usability testing. When you compensate your participants, you find people a lot faster. As long as you're clear with them, like you're getting paid to do the test, you're not getting paid to like tell us anything positive, right? Then I don't think it really biases the study.
And what if you recall, what's your general going rate? If you had a budget for that, any sense of what you pay people?
Yeah, so it does depend on who you're doing the tests with, right? Like if you're just doing them with like general public, you can probably get away with like $50 to $60 per test. Start there. If you're not getting a good response rate, increase it. And that's for like an hour-long test. Now, if you're working with like doctors or like highly specialized field, sometimes money isn't even the thing that they want, Sometimes what we've done is we'll do like a sort of an honorarium in their name. We'll give them like a gift card to that they can use to donate to a charity. And a lot of times like people that are making that much money, like that's a much more enticing incentive for them.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
What do you think of long-term customer task force? Where in my previous industry, we would take the big, the middle, and the small and take a representative sample from each and put them on one quarterly task force. where they were supposed to represent the interests of the whole of the group. Do you like seeing churn, or do you like seeing consistency in the people along the path of the process? Or do you always want to have a new set of eyes?
Yeah, you want that new set of eyes, right? Because you don't necessarily want the same people completely driving the evolution of your product, right? Because there could be a whole sea of fish out there who have different perspectives, have different opinions that you're not taking into account. So I think, it's fine to test multiple times with the same people, but you want to make sure that there's like a significant time gap and that you are rotating new people into the process. Sometimes you don't have that option though. Sometimes, you can only get a hold of the same people. I do think that's better than not talking to anyone. But a lot of times what I see is like companies are afraid to go outside of their existing customers. But if you're compensating people, you can use a tool like respondent.io, or there's like a lot of different recruiting tools out there to find people who fit the mold of your prospective customer and test with them, right? Doesn't have to be your current customers.
I guess in our case, it became a position of almost boardship, a position of privilege to be considered and on. So it was hard to create the churn because it created, I'm on the board, so I have to say. So it was almost more difficult to introduce new, fresh blood in what was a very, I'll say it, male-dominated, stagnated industry. Mm-hmm. Unwilling to bend or change. So you've got to cater to the egos a little bit in order for me to have achieved, such a hierarchy of the players. We're all participating in the growth of the company for all the little retail guys underneath of them. So you wanted the power players at the table, and it was difficult to unseat them because once they're in that particular industry at that particular time, it was all about not necessarily the money, but the name and the accoutrements that came with it. I can get this feature pushed through because I'm on the task force and I'm going to make it my, power position on this particular journey. So it was hard to get real representation when you've got the power players representing their egos as opposed to representing their peers.
Yeah, that is a challenging, I think, scenario. I think it would be really important, if you're doing that kind of sort of advisory team, to set expectations from the beginning. We're going to roll people off of this every month. And just because you make a recommendation does not mean that we're going to build it necessarily. Yep. Right?
Hey, JD, I would add something here too, because think about it from the context of a white labeled service as a platform, right? So we've dealt with companies where their app isn't actually what you use. It's what you configure based on your needs, right? So there was a menu for early mobile ordering for quick service restaurants. They had 3 dynamics of clients: the massive global chains like Burger King, and then smaller regional chains like Cheesecake Factory or what have you, and then even smaller yet. And so to your point, when you think about something that is a platform and within that ecosystem of customers are like whales and minnows and everything in between, when I put my product management hat on, how you build features, how you architect the system is based on, a lot of insights that can come from this persona work. For example, large firms don't want their data commingled. They want, single tenant, not multi-tenant, or multi-tenant, not single tenant data structures. And so if the research helps get into that level of decision, which can affect architecture and real big spend decisions on how this system is built and deployed, to your point, if you only listen to the big guys or if you only listen to the small companies say, I don't care if my data is commingled with other customers because I don't want to pay for my own proprietary data set. So having this structured set of decisions, again, it's about creating a couple things, right? Like kind of maximum optionality for the product owner, the person that has to go get the funding to build this thing, and a set of structured trade-offs where if we wait towards this class of customer, well, that might be the right decision in the short term because they're the most consistent, reliable, you know what I mean, whatever it is, they pay their bills on time, versus smaller ones that are harder to, there's a big market, but it's a harder market to capture and address. So it's about just, again, being able to have that info to make these decisions. And I know we focus a lot on the upfront piece here, but I think it is good as we kind of round out the time here to say all of this is to, again, help make decisions faster and make decisions that don't set you up for having to rewrite things because you didn't ask, you missed opportunities to ask the questions early on. So with that said, I guess maybe TN or JD, was there anything else you wanted to cover? I know we're 15 minutes over here, so I just want to respect that.
No, I mean, there is more content in here, but I think it's pretty self-explanatory. You all should be able to go through the slides. There are more resources in here that you can click into and see. But yeah, I think we're good to wrap it up.
Yeah, this was great. Thank you guys, JD, Pat. Thank you guys so much for doing this. Obviously, we apologize for running late, but we have a lot of people still on. So obviously the content was extremely apt and very useful for me, for sure. I found this super useful. And, in terms of continuing on with this group, if you guys are interested, subject to JD and Pat, of course, we could do maybe like a part 3 maybe or something like that, depending on their availability and their desire. But we can also communicate on the channel itself in terms of posting the deck, and if there's Q&A. And I think what I found from very interesting was we can all learn from each other. We all bring different expertise, skill levels, and analogous experience to the table, and that could be very useful as we build out our personas and just kind of continue on this product journey. But absolutely wonderful masterclass session, guys. Thank you so much. And to the alumni on the call, thank you guys for joining us. And, let's keep this, this isn't over. Let's just keep moving the ball forward and growing and developing. Colleen, did you have a comment?
Nope, just clapping, just saying thank you.
Oh, okay. Gotcha. Thanks. So with that, I wish you guys a great day. And again, thank you for joining. And, let's carry the conversation over to the Slack channel. And if we have enough, if enough of you want to continue and do the next step, then maybe Pat and JD can do another session in the coming weeks. Thank you guys so much for joining.
Yeah, thanks everyone. Thanks, Tien. Take care, guys.
Everyone.